You're listening to the Adventure Party for the third week of May 2023. This week, in part 747 of a 4-podcast limited series, the party discussed Metaplot in our Tabletop Games. The Adventure Party, discussing tabletop related gaming the Irish way.
Welcome to the party, and obviously picking up from the threads of the last 17 or 18 episodes, I'm sure you've all been dying to find out how things conclude for our brave adventurers. For one, Savage Mick.
I'm Dave.
And I return as Warlord Scarr. You thought I was dead in episode 513, but I've returned, and the explanation requires a reference all the way back to episode 47 in order to get the context.
Yes, well, obviously you'll know that in intimate detail.
Yes, everyone's watched everything, right? We're in the realm of binge podcasting, right?
I tend to just dip in and out, so I kind of know who some of the characters are, but I no idea why those two are at odds.
We've been friends for 25 years.
So we're going to talk today about something we've sort of been kicking around for a little while, is this idea that Metaplot tends to show up every so often in systems, in games, in the stories that surround games. And we thought we'd just riff on it for a little bit because we can. And all of all Adventure Party episodes stand alone. See our long-running Tome of Gygax series for the counterfactual to that. But for the most part, we tend to keep things discreet. But not all game writers or game companies do. And eventually, a lot of them fall prey to the idea of introducing a little meta-narrative into proceedings. Any famous or fabulous examples, folks?
Well, let's just get one out of the way. Mr. Werewolf Vampire Ghost from World of Darkness. I think we should probably just mention that he exists and then not mention it again.
Is that Samuel Height?
I believe that's the name.
That name, I think that's the name. Utterly broken. I remember seeing the character sheet many years ago, and dear God, I wonder if that character was actually played by one of the designers.
Oh, as I said, I don't know if we want to get into detail on that. It could go ugly.
Well, he's a perfect example of what we're talking about, though. I remember one of the very few Werewolf second edition supplements that I had. It was set in a lunatic asylum. You were allowed to call them that back then. And Samuel Height was one of the main antagonists, although in an early incarnation. So I think he was only sort of a half werewolf / werewolf hunter at that point. But obviously, he sort of caught in the imagination of the World of Darkness writers. And yes, he kept showing up with new and varied powers stolen from magical creatures. And usually, I think he was looking for the scalps of your PCs to add their abilities to his collection. I don't know if he got the ball rolling on the very famous World of Darkness kind of meta narrative, but he was certainly a key player in some of the early stuff. Just in case anyone's wondering who Samuel Height is, I must find that supplement. I can't remember what it's called.
I'd say Height is just the most brazen example of very powerful NPCs basically doing most of the plot, seemingly in White Wolf. I mean, that is an impression I've been left with. That could be unfair.
Well, let's just be absolutely clear. When we're talking about Metaplot here, it's not just that games and game systems tend to sometimes have very recognizable NPCs, but it's that inclination that writers and creators then sort of get into their heads to give them important things to do that then everybody who's playing the game is kind of made painfully aware of. Elminster's another good example. We've got Gandalf at home of the Forgotten Realms to sort of push major events along, which your players and player characters then are supposed to get swept up in.
Yeah, the idea is that because obviously they read all the novels of Elminster and his many adventures, that obviously they're huge Elminster fans and will totally be fine with him showing up, dumping half a dozen side quests on them, and heading off to have tea with Mordenkainen.
Yeah, high-fiving Drizzt on the way.
Yeah, if your players are big Drizzt fans or big Mordenkainen fans or what have you, then having a cool NPC that everyone likes as a feature in your campaign is perfectly fine. But that's not really how these things tend to be written. They tend to be written as as like the NPC inserting themselves into the player's thing and giving them the direction that they definitely didn't have.
I'm getting the feeling that the rest of you guys aren't necessarily too wild about meta plots and games. You're not fans, I take it.
Well, it's not that I dislike the concept, it's that I find it fascinating why there's such this big disconnect between the writers who put them in and their audience members. Because my understanding was that, well, it may have taken a while to develop, but the backlash against Metaplot got very heated throughout the 90s. Although, to be fair, that might simply be the rise of the internet and thus the internet hate culture being born around the early Metaplot times of the 90s.
Yeah, the 90s are great for probably the height of Metaplot, although I would argue that we're probably seeing a renaissance again. But let's just lay out some of the big Metaplot games of the 90s. Dave, any favorites?
Slay Industries.
Good one.
There's a handful of NPCs, including Mr. Slayer, who drive the plot forward, and like it does seem that nothing's going to change in that universe unless it's part of the plan. With the capitalization. Again, impression.
How about you, Scar? You got any favorites from the 90s era? Metaplot heavy?
See, I imagine I missed a lot of the World of Darkness stuff directly, so a lot of my exposure to the stuff is, well, sitting in 20 Gamers and hearing the war stories from the WOD veterans as they lambasted the whole concept. For me, I guess I sort of pick it up as looking back on my more recent investigations on old D&D modules. I see elements of Metaplot slipping into a whole bunch of things. One particular one is the Vecna storyline, which sort of infamously sort of inserted itself into a whole bunch of big modules that were really well hyped in the second edition days, and started off badly, sort of recovered, but it was also sort of infamous at the same time, even the best interpretation. It sort of got roped into, well, what do they call them? WotC for when they were going from second ed to third ed, started advertising certain modules as campaign removal, where run this module and your campaign will end, which is an interesting way of selling a new edition.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned the WOD meta plot there that you were sort of peripherally aware of, which is kind of the point, right? These were ways of getting. That's one of the thing about gaming meta plots is that even if you're not playing the game actively or even following it that closely, you do start to pick up on the events of the game. If someone mentions Warhammer 40,000 to you, you kind of go, "Oh yeah, the Horus Heresy and the Primarchs and all that stuff." That's the kind of meta plotty stuff that we'll talk about 40k in a little bit. Shadowrun Shadowrun sort of had an evolving storyline. One of the things I'd say, metaplots do require a frequent enough release schedule that you can keep injecting new little bits of story in along with whatever it is you're selling between the covers, be it a scenario or a splat book or a background book on a place, and it'll carry your meta plot sort of stuff with it. So yes, so you get it communicated, as you say, overheard conversations and sort of war stories from those who are in that community. And then, if every so often you pick up a book and read something, go, oh, that seems to mention things that I've vaguely heard about. I wonder what's going on there. But WOD, World of Darkness, is pretty good for that because it had so many books coming out.
Yeah.
There was this constant schedule of stuff to feed the meta plot. For my money, I think Cyberpunk had a sort of an interesting flirtation with Metaplot because it kept rebooting and setting the timeline on a little further and further. So certain things got carried over, the further exploits of Johnny Silverhands or someone like that. But never really developed to the level that, say, World of Darkness did, or to some extent Cyberpunk. I remember the death of Duncan's Alien, who was a dragon that ran for president in the Shadowrun storyline. Like that got an entire book released to itself, the last Will and Testament.
Yeah, trying to be the Death of Superman of RPGs.
Yeah, but I mean, it was I'd never really read it. I ran some Shadowrun. I was kind of fond enough of the world, but never really got much into the meta plot. But even that stood out. Like these are, I mean, meta plots, to their credit, are great ways of raising attention for your game.
Yeah, I think the element of this sort of thing as a sort of almost like an advertisement is something we sort of overlook because as real genuine hardcore gamers, we have a tendency to look at any gaming product as game material specific to our game, but I'm not sure that was a universally believed idea in certain points, particularly what the 90s, and that there was, I don't want to say it's a deliberate attempt, but sort of a molded by the market attempt to appeal to the people who bought books to read. The people who buy RPG books aspirationally, or even wargaming books aspirationally. I know I was in the 90s as a tiny wee one proto gamer in the wilds of Donegal. I know I would have bought any random 40k codex I could have got my hand on for the tiny scraps of wargaming fluff. And I would have been technically a market. Whether I was niche or core market is another question.
40K is an interesting case study because if any of you have been around as long as I have, will remember, not around long enough to remember the Rogue Trader days, but certainly when the second edition of Warhammer 40,000 hit, the war game, the codexes that came along with that were some of the best for story. So you started to get, if you read the Space Marines or the Chaos Marines codexes, you started to get an impression of this thing called the Horus Heresy, which is the defining event in the 40k scenario setting. I mean, and now we're what 100 novels in on the narration of that event and the piecing apart of every single aspect of it. But back then, if you go back to the 90s, the Horus Heresy was kind of a thing that sat in the background of the game and informed a lot of the game, but no one really knew everything there was to know about it. Certainly not to the extent that we do now. But it certainly sort of it was very kind of metaplot in its purest sense, metaplot of events rather than specific named characters. The thing about the 40k metaplot, the Horus Heresy, is that most of the main actors were dead or removed by the time you get to the game itself in its at that point current setting. So you didn't have to worry about running into Rogel Dorn or Karen the Betrayer. They were off somewhere else in the universe, or they hadn't been seen in 1,000 years.
It's a big universe.
That brings us to the very meta plot heavy 40k that we have today, where off the back of the sort of we've kind of mined a lot of the Horus Heresy stuff, and now the current 40k timeline is kicking along at a fantastic rate. They've just had the second Loyalist Primarch reemerge in the last couple of months. I think Lionel Johnson has shown up again.
Yeah.
On the he's playing second fiddle to Rabute Gilliman, or Robot Gilliman, as some like to call him, who is another of these returned Primarchs who was around 10,000 years ago for the defining episode of the Metaplot, and now they're kicking that plot on a Metaplot that stayed pretty much static for about 20-25 years, has now all of a sudden been turbocharged with new events and yeah, I mean it's done an awful lot to drive interest in the universe.
And it's kicked off a process of them releasing an awful lot of books which are much heavier on just providing story. Like I don't think the average Arcs of Omen book or whatever Psychic Awakening books. I think a huge chunk of those is dedicated not to, as in the old days, army lists. They have some army lists, some units, and a little bit of that Golden Demon miniature painting show off. But I think an awful lot of these books are just the narrative and the art being given center stage. What was once flavor in between sections of dry plot and then big rules chunks and pretty miniatures has now gone from being the inserts to being part of the product. And that's interesting because it shows, yeah, obviously there's a market for this fluff. It's it's both more welcoming for newcomers than trying to tease out plot threads from 1,000 random quotes about doing your duty and purging the Xenos, but also it's not quite a novel. It's still technically a part of the 40k war game product line and not, one of the 157 Horus Heresy books on the shelf. And I guess that's one of the contentions about this kind of metaplot approach is if the idea is to bring across a story from your gaming product, would it not be narratively better to push this into the fully non-interactive mediums of print or overpriced web series, or is putting it in the quote-unquote game product a better option? And I think that's where you're going to get arguments on both sides.
It's a great question, and it does speak to one of the problems that people have with Metaplot or Metaplots, is the kind of the FOMO, the fear of missing out, that would drive purchases for things that you might not necessarily want, but you're kind of invested in the story, so you want to keep up and find out what happens. One of the other great sort of games that caught a Metaplot, kind of the way you catch a head cold, was Magic the Gathering, which certainly when it kicked off, I started my journey with Magic in, I want to say, revised and our fourth edition, where there really wasn't. I mean, there was a few cards. You read the cards with some flavor text, and it was a weird and wild world, but nothing coherent. The whole point being it was kind of a multiverse. And then I went into a very deep Magic phase.
And that's when the Weatherlight saga started.
Exactly, Weatherlight, and then recognizable characters who kept showing up again and again, and in their story sort of started to bring some shape to the other kind of mythic figures that have been teased at, like Mishra, I think,
Mistra and Urza.
and Urza, and their story gets kind of fleshed out, and then it drags in different factions. And the Phyrexians are back at the moment. They're kind of the bad necro mechanical
Yeah.
weirdos, and they've had like 10 years of story in the Magic timeline now. I fell out of it a long time ago, but you can see it happening in games where sometimes a game will catch a meta plot when enough kind of interest in, well, why am I doing this stuff? Why is this happening in the game? Sort of it forces the writers or creators to start satisfying the ludo narrative, the narrative side of the ludo narrative sort of contract. But that's again, you're trying to piece it together. So it's a great question you ask. Like, is it even a very good way of delivering a story by kind of putting it in, couching it in rules or in books or on cards, or whatever, or should they just come clean and release a web series or write the novel, get that over and done with?
Honestly, I tend to prefer short pieces of fiction to give inspiration, to give insight into how characters, as envisaged by the developers, operate in a given setting. If I want to read about the adventures of super awesome NPCs for most of the book, I can buy a novel.
Yeah. One of the vital elements of game fiction is setting tone in that way and then giving a sense of what it is. You can get it by with just art if you're got a really good art direction. You don't need to have pages on pages of fluff or a whole bunch of spin-off novels if you have really good art direction or a good explaining voice. But adding in fiction is a really good way of bringing across tone as a writer intends it, and that's one of the big things is that writers want to control tone, particularly in these days of endless meme culture where you give 4chan an inch and they will meme your super serious grimdark game right into the ground.
Well, they embrace it. They elevate it in some ways.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That kind of stuff is really good for creating a fandom, but it can be poison if you're trying to be taken seriously. So, you want to have, so writers feel compelled. Oh, let's put the official tone-setting fiction here at the front of our book and really push it in order so that they have the first word on what this is supposed to look like. And then, having a whole bunch of dumb memes about it on Reddit or whatever doesn't cripple your the credibility of your fiction. It simply it shows that the fans enjoy it. And
I don't know. I don't think anyone's hunting for any literary prizes for this stuff. It's kind of back at the cornflake pack kind of writing for the most part. We kind of hinted at some of the downsides of meta narratives, meta plots at the start of this, where you end up sidelining your players in favor of the exciting adventures of somebody or other who the original writer of the game thought was very good, very sort of interesting. But the meta narratives that have really succeeded, and I think 40k is the early 40k or the Horus Heresy stuff is a good example, is that it kind of leaves you with a sense of the sort of the broader framework in which you're playing your game, and you'll have common sort of historical touchstones or events to draw upon without nailing down all of the details and kind of constraining what you as a GM or you as a player can do with the bits and pieces that you have in front of you. Trying to think of another good example. Now, Legends of Five Rings predates Magic the Gathering in terms of CCG with meta narrative. It had a lot of personalities, but they were always in flux in terms of an on-off again series of alliances and wars, which you could then sort of partake in by fighting some of these battles or by taking part in tournaments that might have storyline outcomes if you were really lucky, if you did well enough. That's probably one of those rare instances when players of a particular thing got to shape aspects of the meta narrative, good or bad.
Yeah, you always get a little feedback from your player base, but yeah, it was rare for them to get it directly like you would with L5R. But that built a very dedicated fan base for that game because they were invested in the plot because they could push it in the ways they wanted. And the infamous moment of them tearing up the Shadowlands Winds envelope is that the players feel like they have ownership of that. That happened because of us, and that's a big thing. Whereas you have examples like Mr. Height. Mr. Height really feels sort of like he's inserting himself into someone else's stuff and derailing what they want. Now you could argue that if you have such a strong narrative in your own personal home game, then maybe you shouldn't be buying random modules and then forcing them onto your players. But then again, maybe you're really hyped to be part of the emerging multi-part WoD Chronicle of the End of the World, because that was how it was advertised to me. It was like, oh no, all these modules aren't just a bunch of failed writing degrees. This is the Chronicle of the Apocalypse or the Gehenna or all of these things, and in X number of years, the game of World of Darkness will end, and if you want to be in the ground floor when it ends, you have to go through these modules and be exposed to people like, well, it wasn't just Height, it was like the Antediluvians were a big one. I'm pretty sure there's a few more.
Yeah, the reemergence of Cain, the first vampire.
Yeah, Kane coming back.
Like that was the big not Meredith, Messandra. No, it's the daughter of Adam's first wife, second wife. Can't remember.
Lilith?
Starts with an M. Lilith, yes, not an M at all. Lilith was another big mover. Those big personalities that sort of impose themselves on a meta narrative. I think one of the problems that they run into is that the meta narratives should be, and certainly the featured players should be a bit like mountains, off in the background, because when they're up close, they overshadow everything. It's very hard to kind of get a sense of, well, this is our game. No, you're just kind of you're a bystander in whatever the writers are up to. Are we going to just sort of draw a line under some of this and say bad writers, they insert the stories they want to tell into the framework of what should be stories you're telling?
Yeah, I think that's not unfair.
Maybe a bit harsh. Not bad writers, just.
But the thing is, like, there's examples of it being done well. Like, as you say, there's ones where these big powerful figures are off in the background and not rendering irrelevant the actions of mirror players and their characters. There's also an Shane pointing out about having players having a way to influence the meta plot. As in, if Samuel Height could be brought down by the actions of a Camarilla, campaign, I mean, that could be very interesting. I imagine a lot of players would have grinned at that possibility.
I will say that, so this is something I keep saying, is that I sort of have this weird perverse fondness for terrible adventure modules because the idea of setting them up so that they can be subverted and pulled apart by players and it into something completely different, that has a weird perverse thing to me. And the idea of like a werewolf party beating up Samuel Height, stuffing him in a lead box, and then having a whole bunch of shenanigans as all of the mages and vampires start trying to steal the box for them and let them out for their own dumb reasons. That kind of thing I could see a party having all kinds of fun with, but that that would mean basically rewriting all of the modules that you started in to make them about a box rather than a theoretical character. And presumably, if you're the type of GM who just wants a whole bunch of random modules to throw into their campaign, then maybe that doesn't appeal to you as much.
All right. Well, let's wrap this one up. I think it's a pretty good topic. And folks, if you want to come along to our Discord, check the show notes for a link. We'd love to hear about your favorite or most despised meta narratives in gaming. For my money, the inklings of meta narrative that have crept into a lot of the big campaigns released for D&D 5th Ed in the Forgotten Realms setting speak to. I think there's just it just happens eventually. If you write enough stuff, meta narrative creeps in as writers like to drop in little things for themselves, little hints, little connective bits of tissue.
And editors too.
And editors, yeah, you see it all over the place. I'd be very curious to see what they do with that, because obviously 5th Ed is sort of drawing to a close. Are we going to get a final 5th Ed campaign that pulls together all these threads and reveals that, aha, it was such and such all along?
Wait, didn't they have like some D&D direct exclusive thing where it was explaining that it was all Vecna, but it was like past Vecna, not current Vecna? Or
There's hints of that, yeah. Black Pylons, I think, was the clue. They've cropped up in a lot of the different campaigns they put out in the last few years. We'll see. Sometimes metaplots just seem inevitable. Get enough writers together.
yeah, that's the thing. Is like that kind of interconnection of plots is just a very natural thing for people to want to do. We like linking our stories together. We like having Finn McCool team up with Cullen to beat Balor or whatever. People have been writing crossover fan fiction for thousands of years, or already telling it, I suppose. It's just like once you have unleash that impulse into your writing, you have to also respect the fact that you have an audience, and the audience also want to insert their ideas. And in the case of a game, that means the players and GMs are going to want their own control over your narrative. And so, inevitably, when the metaplot ideas of the writers meet up against the metaplot ideas of the people playing the games, at a certain point, one is going to have to win out, and that's where the tension comes in.
Yeah. So, do you have a favorite? Or one you despise?
I think I could do the Great Slave Lords as a thing. So let me put that in as my answer, even if I haven't run that one yet.
How about you, Dave? Any gaming metaplots that you particularly enjoyed, or that you just wish would stay in the writers' room?
I actually liked the Harlock's Legacy stuff from Dark Heresy First Edition. As in, it was hinted at early in the line, and then became more and more of a thing until the Harlock's Legacy trilogy of adventures was released. But they were fun. They were a lot of fun, and players they weren't bound into a particular course of action that were NPCs, but ultimately it was the players' actions that decided what was going to happen with ramifications for the sector. So, you know what, I was quite happy with them.
Excellent. Well, we're going to close this one out, folks. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for kind of following the threads of our ongoing storyline. Whatever will happen to Scarr now that he's lost that eye. For my money, Slay Industries is perfect metaplot, perfect game, world. It has never put a foot wrong. It's Slay Industries metaplot is kind of wild. So both versions of it. So whatever your truth is, for now, this party's over.
Thanks for listening to the Adventure Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account @AdventurePTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, link in the show notes. The Adventuring Party is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike with version 3 license.
Mr. Slayer did nothing wrong.
Like to be fair, like the Slay industry, like I've only read the first Ed stuff to be fair, but it is fun. Like
Yeah.
it's just I could see it being horribly restrictive if you're trying to play it straight as a GM. Like it could be just my reading of it. Like
Well, it's I kind of like the fact that it imposes itself on the setting rather than on the players. The players are going to suffer regardless. But
yeah,
the way the world of progress is the way it is because of the actions of all of the characters in the meta plot. But that none of them sort of descend from the tower and put their finger on you and go, right, we're going to do this today. You're just like you're so low down the pecking order that
mm,
it's the mythology really.
mm.
But it's a mythology that kind of moves along. They did the new Cannibal Sector book there a couple of years ago, and they've moved things along. It's all getting worse. Obviously, that's the best way
Oh,
any meta plot can go. Everything
oh,
gets worse.
yeah, I do remember the Cannibal Sector book from the first edition. Jesus Christ, it's horrible. Like like to be fair to I'm trying to think of the name of the main writer.
Dave
Alsop, was it?
Alsop, Dave
Yeah.
Alsop, yeah, and main artist.
He must have some funky dreams, is all I'm saying.
That man probably sleeps as soundly as a baby lamb because he's gotten all of his demons out onto paper.
Fair
Are
point.
you meant to be still recording this?
Yeah,
Yeah, this is all going in back matter. I'll put this
Okay.
after the.
oh God.
Because this is look the real listeners. We know you're listening right now. The real listeners get to kind of carry on the real story of the adventure party.
Yeah.
Okay, let's leave it at that.
All right.